You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are here in our second week discussing Eric Redman's death in Hilo, chapters 12 to 27. And Herds.
Yeah, Flex?
It's a bloodbath. Nobody more has died.
Yes. Well, it's been fun, hasn't it? Because we've
Actually, no, that's not true. There's the new park murder.
That doesn't count. They don't matter to the story, so I don't know that it matters at all to...
Whoa, spoilers, Herds.
Well, this is the thing. Not to say that, the park murders don't matter
It's
at
not
all.
a spoiler for the record. This is a bit.
I want to be clear that, it's not that there is no intrigue to the mystery of the park murders at all.
Yes.
But... the characters in that murder are not named. It's, another corpse, and there'll probably be another one. We're more interested in letting the murders happen and trying to catch the murderer with a ring of unmanned police cars, which is...
Yeah, I think the strange thing is, right, that the novel has sort of entered this stretch where all of the characters within the novel are treating it like a whodunit. But the novel feels as a reader like a how catch 'em. And that discrepancy is weird and kind of fun.
Yeah, it's certainly different. I mean, for me, the most interesting part is the character drama as well. We're introduced to the TMT finally and all the characters that are involved in that. Even though we're kind of following along with the how catch 'em and the whodunit, the really interesting stuff is around Kawika Wong and his refusal to tell the truth, which is kind of fun. I like that we're getting to follow a protagonist who is just trying to save his own skin.
The novel is very much written sort of authorially from Kawika's perspective, but it is still the omniscient narrator who actually guides us around. But the omniscient narrator seems to sort of side with Kawika in a way that makes his constant refusal to do the right thing a whole unusual layer of tension that we don't really get in the sort of mystery novels that we cover.
I like that tension there is kind of exemplified with the opinions of the other characters in the book, because even Terry, his former mentor, who's kind of in on the conspiracy to an extent, Kawika says, Terry, we have to get our story straight. We have to tell the big lie. And Terry's like, no, what has happened to you in the past 11 years or however long it's been?
And as you were saying last week, of course, there is this tension of the novel just refusing to mention the ending of the previous novel in the series in ways that are increasingly bizarre.
Yeah, it's got the same weird quirk, let's call it, where the entire character drama of this novel is around revealing the secrets that were held at the end of the previous novel, but we literally can't do that because we would spoil the physical book.
Yes.
So there's a lot of Anna Cavallo.
Yeah, she's doing the investigation.
And she figures him out. She basically is the real detective of the novel in that scene where she says, I reckon based on your personality and who you'd want to protect and the way that you go about doing it, you're telling me a load of crap, but I know Terry's going to tell me what's going on. But she basically figures out the plot of the previous book during the hearing, which is, I guess, that is a pretty fun device for recapping, right?
Right? That in that scene where in this really weird circumstance where the narrator is sort of semi-omnisciently taking Kawika's side, Anna is doing the ethical thing in the scene on paper, but also because Kawika is in the running to become the chief of police, she is absolutely also vying for her own power. It's filthy no matter how you look at it, and I love it.
It's kind of fun that way, that it's got that realism to it, As far as we know, there are no true heroes in this story. What is right and wrong is really the question we're trying to challenge today on Death of the Reader.
Almost more why do people do wrong, even with us not being able to agree on what wrong is? And I think the other thing that's super fascinating about this book is the way that it is using all of these character motivations to build up the main mystery in this very underhanded way that I keep loving way more than I think I'm going to. For example, there's this scene where we are going to interrogate one of the lead suspects, Emma Phillips, who we meet in chapter 12. And Kawika gets dropped off. at the house by Elle, his wife, and they like see each other at a distance from the car. And one of the things that they'd sort of set up is in this earlier scene is that Elliot had met with Patience Quinn, his ex, at hospital, but because the only other character in that scene is close to non-talking Jarvis, Kawika's father who's had a stroke and can't really talk, there's sort of this bit of tension that like, oh, maybe the two blondes in the story are sort of actually playing as each other, and that this is one character pretending to be someone else, and there's all of this weird tension going on. And Eric is so gracefully closing off those possibilities in a way that doesn't completely obscure them because we're seeing characters from a distance. It very much reminds me of the same way where in Solari Gentle's The Mystery Writer, you'd be thinking about a thing, and then Solari would have that character walk into the room with a gun, and it would be like, okay, well, I guess not then.
I think there's a few less guns involved in this novel, but that could always change. What I like, obviously, I'm always up for that like historical touch, and the bluntest way to put it is that there's an interesting case of straw man going on with the suspects of the TMT situation.
Yes, because we are in this stretch of chapters introduced to the 30 meter telescope as a plot device, where it was only in the foreword so far.
Well, that's the interesting thing, right? Is that we finally know that there's this telescope that they want to build on the top of the mountain, but how and in what circumstances was kind of up for debate. The way that Eric kind of represents this is that there are three groups led by these different people. There's one group led by a true blood Hawaiian called Jeffrey, who is like got tattoos and piercings and everything, and he wants no telescope. And then you got Jonathan, the angry science man, who says, we kind of want the telescope, but we don't want to break the previous telescopes, because that's what Peony, our actual murder in this novel, that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to break all the existing telescopes and build the big 30-meter telescope on top of them. And then there's Grace, who is probably my favorite of the three. She is like a matriarch, and she spends most of her time with Kawika not actually talking about what she wants directly, but rather telling stories about the Hawaiian people and how they've been taken advantage of. And I really enjoy her in particular because she presents herself as being very friendly and upbeat, but she's actually trying to like manipulate our protagonist emotionally, which is like a really fun duality there. But my point is, in the foreword of this novel, we get a disclaimer that these representations of this issue is from 10 years ago and is not relevant necessarily entirely to today's modern discussion about the telescope. He's basically admitting that these characters are not real and we should not take their discussions as reality, which I kind of like, because it means that we can have these kind of silly, cartoonishly angry science man, but his point is still relevant. Like we're trying to like paint the canvas.
I think the other thing that's really interesting about the choice of time for this novel is that, as best I understand, the 30 meter telescope has been basically on halt for the past 10 years. And there's sort of this like introspection in like, why haven't we done anything over the past 10 years, in the same way that Kawika hasn't really done anything to fix his dirty cop mistakes over the past 10 years. Like, the parallel there feels very deliberate to me.
Why haven't we solved this issue? And their reason is, quote, it's complicated, right? Like, that's the reality of these sorts of situations. And obviously, like, I think that the way that these suspects who are part of the TMT mystery, but it also seems like through the way that the mystery is unfolding, that it's not really about the TMT entirely. So why are they here?
A lot of these issues that we deal with the 30 meter telescope and all these suspects talking about the values for the telescope here in its various ways, I think kind of openly don't actually have a lot to do with the plot of the novel, but they speak very strongly to the themes that the novel is interested in exploring. The further we get into the book, I think the more I'm starting to respect the choice to, let's say, use island time in our wording. We're taking our time and mulling over it, and it doesn't necessarily feel purposeful, but it does give you a lot of time to think. For a book that takes itself as slowly as this one does, it's actually a really compelling way of building that framing device.
I mean, there's definitely a theme as well of like, if all of these people can get kind of caught up in the politics of the island and the politics of being a cop and make bad decisions up to and including the police chief, then like introducing, these younger characters, especially the cop characters, and trying to like keep them from falling into the same pitfalls as their predecessors is definitely something that the novel is meditating on, which I appreciate.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to leave it, Herds, as we go over into the mystery section, dangerous as it always is. This is Death of the Reader, your murder mystery world tour here on 2SER 107.3. We are talking Eric Redman's Death in Hilo. Stick around for more on your murder mystery world tour. You're listening to Death of the Reader, your murder mystery world tour. Flex and Herds here. Today we are discussing the Hawaiian noir murder mystery Death in Hilo, starring Kawika Wong, and we are joined by Eric Redman, author of this novel, American lawyer, and climate activist. Eric, it's wonderful to have you on Death of the Reader. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, in Bones of Hilo, your previous novel, Kawika was a young cop trying to prove himself to his colleagues as a working-class individual, but now in Death in Hilo, he's become part of the establishment, trying to cover up for misconduct he committed in that book a decade ago. What made the 30 Metre Telescope the right backdrop for that story?
Well, the 30 Metre Telescope is an extraordinary controversy. The whole state has been wrapped up in it for decades. Let me just explain it very simply. There's a huge mountain in Hawaii, on the big island of Hawaii, called Mauna Kea. Mauna Kea is almost as tall as Mount Rainier in Seattle. It's 13,700 feet. And it is the best spot in the world for observatories that are based on land. And it already has 13 observatories. The 30 Metre Telescope will be the best telescope ever done on land. 30 meters is the size of its array, and so as a result would allow penetration incredibly deep into space, much further than any existing telescope. However, the land at the top of Mauna Kea is sacred land to the Hawaiians, and there has been very, very little historical attempt to recognize that there's now a telescope industrial complex on top of the mountain, and the 30 Metre Telescope was the straw that broke the camel's back. So the proposal to build it has led to decades of controversy. There's been this enormous battle between the astronomers on the one hand, for whom it would be the very best telescope ever built, and the Hawaiian people who are concerned culturally, and for people who support that. And then the third element just being the environmental protection of such a very high elevation is very difficult. So it's an enormous controversy. It's been going on for decades, but no one outside the Hawaiian Islands knows very much about it. And so I thought it would be a good backdrop, because in a murder mystery, you want to convey information about a place that is the setting, but you want it to be integral to the plot. You don't want it to just be incidental. So in this case, the key murder victim is someone who is working on the 30 Metre Telescope project. And that allows you and forces you to get into the 30 Metre Telescope controversy in order to figure out, how is this murder going to be solved?
I love historical fiction, so I really appreciate any sort of novel that kind of lets you dive into a real world issue that you might not have thought relevant or interesting. So I think that's really awesome. You've decided to make Death in Hilo a more direct follow-up to Bones than I would have actually anticipated. There's a lot of time in Death in Hilo spent discussing the events and the fallout from the climax of your previous story. I'd like to know how you handled the challenge of expressing Kawika's struggle without outright spoiling your previous book.
Here's the way I look at it. Death in Hilo is a sequel to Bones of Hilo in just the sense you identified, which is there's a storyline that continues through from one to the other. But it's also a standalone book. You don't have to have read Bones of Hilo to read Death in Hilo. I hope Death in Hilo will encourage people who haven't read Bones of Hilo to go back and read it, but you don't have to have read one to read the other. In the first book, Kawika Wong, he's only 29 years old. He's really a neophyte. In Death in Hilo, he's now 41 years old. And moreover, he's in Honolulu, and he's the head of homicide detectives in Hawaii's biggest city. But as he's dealing with a serial killer in Honolulu and a body that can't be identified, there's a young reporter who's 24 years of age, and she's trying to make her career. And she decides to dig into how the murder that he handled in the first book was handled. In this book, we're dealing with the fact that, okay, something's come up and now he's haunted by something from his past. That in itself is not unconventional, I don't think. It happens that the thing that's going to haunt him from his past was actually all covered in the first book. So that's the way I structured it to connect the two. But I really don't want any reader to think that they wouldn't enjoy Death in Hilo if they hadn't read Bones of Hilo first.
One of the things that's really interesting about Zoe as our secondary perspective character is that Zoe is hunting our other perspective character in Kawika. And we sort of know by premise of it being a crime novel with Kawika as the protagonist that Zoe can't get a full success on her journey, but that to some extent, because of the misconduct that we hear about from the previous book, that maybe she should. What made that journalistic cat and mouse game fun to write for you?
Well, in my own experience, investigative journalists are often very much like this Zoe Akona. I think she's very realistic. She's motivated, by possibility of fame and advancement, and exposing what, in her way of thinking, is actually corruption. Now, the interesting thing about the case that she's trying to figure out, she is looking at it from the perspective of, did they procedurally do the right thing? Did they charge the right person for the murder, for example? And at the time, they were thinking, what's the right thing to do morally? I think that tension is very real, because I think that's how investigative journalists work. And I think people that are investigating often have very complicated reasons for doing whatever it was they did that is being investigated, but it's very, very hard for those to be conveyed successfully to an investigative journalist. And it's impossible to persuade an investigative journalist to drop a story just because you want to say to them, look, there are good reasons not to publicize everything that happened before. They're not going to drop it for a reason like that.
Once the murder has kind of properly kicked off, we get a series of really fun chapters where we meet representatives of various groups that could have concerns in the way that the TMT project is handled. We're kind of primed to eye them with skepticism because they're part of a murder investigation, but they are also representing these real world opinions and stances about the TMT. So I'd like to know what sorts of methodologies that you actually used to try to get the right balance of fact and fiction for these sometimes even fanatical characters.
Well, let me see if I can give this as a couple of numbered points. Number one, I'm totally besotted by Hawaii. I love Hawaii. I've spent 40 plus years going to Hawaii and owning homes in Hawaii. My wife has 8 native Hawaiian first cousins, and they have been important parts of our lives. So I wanted to set these murder mysteries in Hawaii. Secondly, there are a tremendous number of murder mysteries set in Hawaii, but most books that are written in Hawaii, to me, there's no realism in them. They may make use of the ancient Hawaiian gods. They may make use of Hawaiian myths, but they don't capture reality. I wanted to bring realism. I wanted to start setting a murder mystery, but having it be realistic in terms of the population. What are the issues that are bothering the population, especially for Native Hawaiians? Native Hawaiians are at the bottom, for the most part, of the various socioeconomic indicators that you might have. There's this side of Hawaii that I don't think you should obscure if you're just going to write books for tourists. And there are contemporary issues like the 30 Metre Telescope. These are real issues that are really happening out there. As I said earlier, I think you don't want to just take in local stuff as window dressing on a murder mystery. You want to have all of that local setting be integral to the murder mystery. And so in this case, the 30 Metre Telescope controversy is one that, yes, I really hope people learn about the controversy as a result of the book. But it's not just added on. It's not just piled on, like frosting on a cake. It's central to the murder mystery that Kawika has to solve, as well as turning out to be central to the murder mystery that he thought he had solved many years before.
Talking about kind of the real issues in Hawaii there, one of the interesting characters in the story is Kawika's wife, Ellie, who has been writing murder mystery novels, her most famous one being based off your last book, so congratulations for that.
She's a good acolyte, yeah.
Yeah. I guess because these two novels are such a distant slice of Kawika's life, there's a sense of fragmented continuity now that he's married in Bones and Hilo compared to the more playboy, faithless character in Bones and Hilo. How did Ellie come to be Kawika's emotional foil for this book, and what made that work given the context you were just talking about?
It was really important to me as part of being realistic. I wanted Kawika not to be a perfect detective. I didn't want to, so many murder mysteries, the detective is like this genius who just by intuition, leaps to successful outcomes, or he's a recovering alcoholic who nonetheless, manages to pull off, great discoveries. I wanted Kawika to be a realistic person. So that means he's imperfect. He's imperfect as a detective. and he's imperfect as a human being. And in the earlier book, the imperfections as a human being have to do in part with the fact that, as you just mentioned, he ends up being torn between two women. And as a result, he inflicts some harm on people by his indecision. But now in the second book, it's now 12 years later. Now he's married, as you say, to this wonderful woman who is a journalism professor, but who also writes murder mysteries. She's intrigued by him as a person for all his imperfections as well as his appealing qualities. And he has a lot of appealing qualities. She's perfect for him because she is untroubled, unlike him. He's troubled in lots of ways. She's filled with good spirits, and she knew that he needed that. He needed a lighthearted, optimistic person in his life. After all, a career of being a homicide detective is going to be very, very cauterizing to your soul, right? You have to see a lot of things that most people would not be able to handle, and he needs the relief from all that she provides him. So they're a very good pair. And in the second book, she's pregnant. So he now has the opportunity to become a father as well. And his own father is a very important character in both books. There's a sense in which she's the right person for him.
We'll have more from Eric Redman next week on the show. Stick around. You're listening to Death of the Reader. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. We are discussing Eric Redman's Death in Hilo, chapters 12 to 27. And it's time for my final theory on the matter.
Yeah, last week you gave a theory about slasher. You reckon it's Jerry Ford's, I think it is?
Jerry Rhodes.
Jerry Rhodes.
One of the two Jerrys who was brought in from LA. There's a great moment in this stretch of chapters where he says, "Oh yeah, no, we had totally the same difficulties with that serial killer we never caught in Los Angeles before I came over here."
Crazy.
It's like, cool. Thanks, Jerry.
Some very similar serial killers that are not the same person. I don't know that you necessarily have to pose a second theory for the slasher.
Well, actually, let me just quickly go over the evidence.
Oh God, which evidence? I'm scared.
Just so that we're caught up, the things that have progressed is that now the park slasher has moved to a new park. He left a driver's license on the body of the new victims so that they could identify them, and he left a note on the desk of Kawika again being like, "Hey, it's me, I moved park as the copycat." Wonder how he got the note there. And basically, they've put a whole bunch of empty police cars around to try scare him off. When Jerry Rhodes is the killer, I'm sure is going to be very effective.
They even point out in the novel that it's kind of a pointless strategy because their strategy is like, maybe we can make him do something different this time, and eventually then they'll make a mistake, hopefully. It's like not a good plan.
Yeah, they're relying on another person dying to help them solve this case they're struggling with.
Maybe the next murder, because there's however many people on the island, and we just have to keep letting people get killed.
Just one by one.
They don't until they're all dead. Yeah, that's the plan.
Anyhow, it's Jerry Rhodes. We're going to move on from that. I don't think that needs exploring. Anyhow, the good news I have heard is that I think Ellie might survive this novel. We haven't had any more death flags.
Good. She's got life flags?
I was really concerned in the first stretch of chapters that it was like, oh, I'm just about to have a kid, I'm about to go on break, about to put out a great new hit novel about my father-in-law who's really been struggling and tell a powerful story about solving a crime with him. We have the scene with Patience and it goes fine and they have a bonding moment. And there's nothing in that sequence where Ellie says anything too suspicious that makes me go, oh no, she's in trouble. So
okay, good.
I'm optimistic.
I'm actually trying to figure out if you're like being sarcastic or genuine.
No, I'm not being sarcastic.
Sure. Okay.
I was concerned.
Good.
I think everything is fine.
Okay, good. Excellent.
I hope I'm not wrong. The other thing is that on page 1.5, 2, depending on how zoomed out I was on my e-reader, we meet Emma Phillips, the first female scientist mentioned in the book, who just happens to share a first name with one of the victims from the DK Parks case in the previous book.
Does she? I hadn't noticed.
What's the mystery here, Herds?
The mystery is how I can keep you away from figuring anything out. Look, here's the thing. I think you need to pose a second theory is what you really need to do.
I do need to pose a second theory, and I have one.
But I will say, I have cut off the novel at chapter 27 because I read chapter 28 and went, that is the most ridiculous chapter I have ever read in my life. I want you to tell me, why have I cut off the novel where I have? How are we actually going to solve this? What's like the narrative that we go down to actually catch our killer? That's what I'd like you to tell me.
The obvious narrative device that we've been presented here is that Ellie wrote a book based off the previous killings, and she's working on a book that involves Jarvis, and so probably Jarvis is going to basically do the thing that Ellie is fictionalizing in 3 Blinks for Yes, this book that they keep mentioning as we build up to chapter 28. So I presume in some ways Jarvis is about to give us a key clue. I don't know what that clue is. We know that he knew Emma's father, so it's possible he's going to recognize Emma, and that's going to kind of lead us to the climax of the novel. But I have absolutely no idea how.
Well, I'll tell you what. The other question I have is you've said like, oh, it's probably Emma because tropes and because she has the same name as someone in the previous book. Just for the record, what is the motivation for killing at least Keone Parks? What's going on there?
I think this is a revenge killing for DK Parks being involved in the death of Thomas Gray, because basically there were 3 people on the boat on which Thomas Gray died in the previous novel, and DK Parks was basically the accomplice that let the murder happen, and then DK Parks was killed to silence him. And I presume, based on Keone like reading the mention of his father's case in the newspaper, that he mentioned it to his boss because he was broken up about it or something, and that made Emma kind of go after him.
Why does Emma care?
That's a great question.
Okay, well, there you go. That's your mystery.
Revenge killing, as I said, is sort of the motivation, but I don't know what has driven her to murder is more the problem.
I don't know if that's specific enough. You basically had the who and the how last week, Flex. Where's your why? What have you been doing all week?
Let me work through my backup theory.
Okay.
I'm starting to suspect Kawika Wong.
What do you mean starting? Why? Based on what evidence?
He's a dirty cop, and we can't talk about what happened in the last case, and he keeps saying that the killer is dead and buried. And I reckon what he means is that he went to therapy between these 2 books. I reckon the reason that we can't talk about who died in the last book is because the twist is going to be that Kawika has been doing it all along. That's why he had to distance himself from his previous 2 girlfriends and couldn't tell them the truth. That's why Ellie was having all the death flags earlier in the novel. I reckon that this is all a setup. I reckon that Emma Phillips is one of the loose threads in Kawika Wong's plan, and now that he's found her again, now that he found Keone Parks following DK Parks' children, this is a stretch. I don't think this is real, but there's even a potential that Jarvis has, had this stroke is because of the terrible trauma of finding out his son's terrible secret. I think that the theme of everyone sort of doing terrible things to try do the right thing from their perspective it still has to be like baked in some way to the like motivation of the novel. So I think that Kawika has sort of become this monster, and the fact that he says the killer is long dead is sort of indicating that he feels like it's dealt with. But now that this trauma is coming back up, now that he's being investigated again, the monster is resurfacing.
I love that theory. I love the idea that Kawika is secretly the killer all along.
Oh, right. Yeah, don't worry. Okay, I figured it out. The thing that had confused me is there's this scene where they're sitting down, they're talking between Tommy and Terry and all of the cops about the old case so that they can kind of straighten out what's happening in the investigation. And they talk about the circumstances in which Thomas Gray was murdered. And they have this question of, well, who drove the getaway boat? And in my brain, I had read that line as, oh, well, it was the killer from the previous book, and we can't mention who they are because that would spoil the previous book. But it's Keone, isn't it? He drove the getaway boat, and that's what the revenge is about.
That certainly sounds like a theory, but why does Emma care about who drove the getaway boat?
Because her dad died in the crime? What?
I think that's probably it for this week, unless there's anything else
I think so. Do you have any questions about my 2 theories, Herds, before we wrap up? My theories are Emma Phillips in the apartment with the gun because Keone drove the getaway boat, or Kawika Wong in Everywhere with the police corruption.
Police corruption is a murder weapon. That's pretty good, actually.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. Next week on the program,
28.
We are going all the way to the end of Death in Hilo by Eric Redman.
It's going to be great.
Looking forward to your company there. This is your Murder Mystery World Tour. we're out of here.
I'm super ready for the old lady in the corner of the room to finally speak up.